Right, welcome everybody. This is the Baines Simmons webinar. This is our first in a series of webinars that we hope to be rolling out on topical subjects, and we hope that you enjoy it and get something out of it, and hopefully give us your ideas on what else we'd like to cover in the future. Just a few domestics then. Thanks very much for joining us. You've got the opportunity to contribute through the questions box. There's a chat box that you'll see in your control panel. Submit any questions and we'll have a look at those and answer as many as we can. So just to confirm timings, 1400 now, we just started, and we will be finished at 1500. So my name is Bob Simmons. I'll be your main host today. We're joined by Duane Kritzinger. Just to let you know, a little bit of technology. Duane is remote, but hopefully we won't have any issues with that, but it's all working okay so far. So just to confirm, we've actually muted your voice communications for this particular event, but in future maybe we'll have a look at that. We're recording the session, just to let you know, and you will receive a link within 24 hours of the completion so that you can take a look at that and obviously share it if that's available. There are some handouts which are available for you to download, and that's within the handouts tab that you'll see on your control panel. If you haven't seen the handouts, then please feel free to take those. That's absolutely fine. Okay, so let's get started then. Just a quick look through the program. I'm just going to go through some introductions at the moment, just to give you a little bit on my background and Duane's. Then we'll have a look at the background behind the EMARs, just to really focus in on what we're trying to achieve with those. We'll then look at implications on approved organisations, and that's where we start to talk about some of the challenges and some of the considerations that you might want to think about if you're doing something with the EMARs. There's the latest EDA views on the implementation. I've got a specific slide on that, and that really comes from the conference that was recently held in Lisbon. So we'll have a look at that, but other comments I will weave in as we go through the presentation. So just got a quick summary, and I'm just going to share with you some of the key issues I think that we should think about at the moment, and then final opportunity then for questions and answers at the end. As I say, please just throw any questions at any time, and we'll do those, and we'll handle those as they go. Okay, so a little bit about myself then. I'm co-founder of Baines Simmons, as it says up there, and I've really been leaning in the areas of airworthiness, regulations, approvals, as well as getting involved in some of the safety aspects of the business as well. Personally, I've got a military background with the Royal Air Force, and then been involved through the Civil Aviation Authority, through into Baines Simmons with the regulations, and actively contributing to the rule making through working with the European defence agencies, and also with a number of military airworthiness authorities around the world. So I lead on the subject within the business, and I'm ably supported by Duane, and I'll hand over to Duane and let him introduce himself. That's gone a little bit quiet straight away. Okay, well, I'll introduce Duane, and hopefully he'll come back and join us. Duane's out with remotely at the moment, so couldn't join us in the office, unfortunately. So Duane, principal consultant. Just made the connection, Bob. There we go. Okay, so Duane, you're online now. So if you'd just like to introduce yourself, please.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. My name is Duane Kritzinger, and I specialise in all matters regarding initial airworthiness in the civil and military domains. I started off my career in the South African Air Force, and I've been working both European and the rest of the world with both civil and regulatory airworthiness. Most recently, I've just returned. Earlier this year, I worked with the Australian authorities, where we looked at adopting the EMARs into their regulatory framework, and we spent a lot of time looking at the pros and cons of the EMAR framework in a military context, and we spent training the regulator as well as industry members to most efficiently adopt these requirements. Thank you, Bob.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Duane. Right then, so we'll start just by looking at the EMARs. The reason we wanted to do this was just to remember what it's all about and what we're trying to achieve. I think with detailed technical requirements, we can get swallowed up by the details and we can forget what it's all about. So we're just going to review some of the background to them, just to keep it fresh in mind what we're actually trying to achieve with them. So, yeah, it's a military approach, a new military approach to managing continuing airworthiness and initial airworthiness, and just coming up with a cohesive set of rules that can actually be shared. Previously, we've had each nation with one or more national systems under their own legal and regulatory systems. And it's been recognised that actually this brought a number of problems which go through at the moment. So in the civil area, the same was experienced, and they started off with the Joint Aviation Authorities of Europe, and they started to work collaboratively, and that's really the model that's been adopted by the EDA and the participating member states. EASA is slightly more authoritative. It actually issues through the EU full regulations which automatically become law within the European Union. So it's a slightly different approach that's not being taken by the EDA as yet. So the framework within the EASA system on which the EMARs are based is all about encouraging commonality so that we can have a competitive and efficient aviation industry. It's so that we can share to a single standard, do single approvals, basically work with each other in a cohesive and common way. So without it, obviously, we've got the certification costs, some spiral certification exercises cost a fortune, and we try and minimise that by doing it once to a single standard for a number of nations. Obviously, there are delays to operational capability, particularly around the certification and possibly other areas as well, where just accepting a single standard would obviously speed that all up. The barriers to spares pooling, becoming more and more standardised, some of the aircraft types that we're seeing entering service now with programs like the Airbus A400M. The intent is that parts can be pooled between operators, reducing the overall costs and helping different operators to support each other to keep the aircraft going with a larger spares pool but distributed amongst the different participants. And finally, cross-border sharing and cooperation. Clearly, if two regulatory systems do not speak to each other or do not connect, then it makes it much more difficult for both approved data for design issues and for parts, etc., to actually flow across borders the way in which it now does within the civil domain. So that's a little bit on the background, but just to raise it up just a little bit more from that, the European Defence Agency was really launched, and it's a non-binding agreement at political level, basically christened the Cyprus Agreement. This is where the participating member states' ministers of defence all committed to work towards a single harmonised standard. And it's exactly to address those issues that we just talked about. Economies of scale, obviously collaboration in there, and of course cooperation across borders. And certainly with some of the NATO and some of the EU operational characteristics, the way in which our assets are shared, then it's going to make it a lot easier if we're all working to one standard. You can see across the bottom there the participating member states, and I hope if you are one of those you can see your flag. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Duane now. Duane's just going to talk us through the regulatory framework. We're not going to spend too much time on this because hopefully you're familiar, but we've got some key points that we'd like to share with you just for your consideration. Okay, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. Yes, so what I'm trying to illustrate here is how the different regulations and documents at the MAWA Forum, the Military Airworthiness Forum, created in order to map this regulatory framework. And the way I've laid it out here is purposefully to try and mirror it back to the EASA regulatory framework. Because as most of you are probably aware, the EMARs originated from the EASA regulations. So what I'm trying to show here is the EDA have created a basic framework document, and its equivalence could be seen in the EASA framework as the basic regulation. And just like the basic regulation sets the foundation for the EASA to operate as a legal entity, this sets the forum or the framework for EDA and the MAWA to operate. Below that, we have two very, very important.
Oh, sounds like we've just lost Duane there, so I'll just jump in. He'll probably cut back in at some stage, but I'll take over there at the moment. So two very important documents that Duane was just about to talk about. The EMAR, which is the process for the recognition between the different member states, which is the mechanism by which the different MAAs accept each other's standards. The other one, definitions and acronyms, can come over as being quite bland, but actually it's really important in terms of really defining what some of the terms mean within the regulations, and thereby having a huge impact on the meaning and therefore the way in which it's implemented. So definitions and acronyms, and this is a nice tidy way to do it in a single document in that way. The next layer down with the EMARs themselves, just bearing in mind that they are requirements and not regulations, and we'll talk about that in a moment, about how they're actually implemented. So they're the actual requirements, the high-level requirements, the actual EMARs themselves. And then you can see in the background the acceptable means of compliance, that's AMC, and the GM, which is the guidance material. And that's really to give more information, if you like, the soft law on how you implement the actual requirements themselves. The EMAC is the certification codes, and that's in the design area, the certification area. It established the design standards for the design certification of aircraft. So most importantly, and really this is where it starts to get interesting, is across the bottom. It's up to each national military aviation authority to implement the EMARs however they choose within their regulatory or within their legal system. Because clearly nations have different legal systems which give them force of implementation. So the actual requirements themselves can be actually adopted, partially adopted, or implemented within law, dependent on how the individual nation wants to take it forward in their system. So this is where we start to drift away from the standardized form that is actually designed within the EMARs, and the one that actually works so well within the civil system under EASA. Under EASA, there are regulations, and therefore there's no variation between the member nation states. And that means that any organisation that is approved to a particular code is automatically configured in a way to actually interface with all of the other stakeholders, regardless of where they are within the EASA system. So the standardization area is really important and really plays through in terms of getting those efficiencies and achieving the high-level benefits that we talked about just now. So, okay, so just coming through then, I'm just very quickly going to whip through. You can see that we've got a number of different options, 4 options there for the adoption of the requirements. This is, as I mentioned, an option to the individual MAAs. Full adoption, which is basically where the nation just chooses just to take the whole lot, the EMARs with the AMC and the guidance material, and just use those as their own requirements, their own laws, whatever works within their system. Partial adoption is basically where there's transcription of the EMARs into the national system, but it's without deviation. Now, in this case, it may well be that some nations choose not to adopt some of the EMARs, but may well adopt others because they're more significant in their nation. Full compliance, this is about the nation demonstrating that their current regulatory system covers the EMARs. And again, this becomes a bit more of a challenge because the compliance demonstration method may well mean that organisations are configured, structured and managed in a non-standard way as was embedded within the EMARs themselves. Partial compliance, and this is where basically there's a declaration by the nation that actually shows that they've taken some of the material within their system and they've actually chosen not to take others. But again, it's in their own individual format that they choose to do that. So the mechanism through the EMAR, which was the recognition, is that basically it's a self-declaration to the MARA forum. So it's up to each individual nation using a questionnaire set to declare how they're implementing the EMARs so that it can be shared between the states. So that's certainly the future. The experience of implementing this, and this is a little bit of experience that comes back from the conference we attended recently, was that at the moment the actual arrangements between individual nations are based on the EMAD process. So there is a questionnaire set, there's a declaration, and then it's up to the individual MAAs to actually compare notes and come to arrangements and agree whether they're satisfied with the other authorities' implementation process, or whether some other arrangements have to be put in place to span the gap between the 2 different systems. So that's just a little bit about the requirements. Something I didn't mention earlier on is that I'm not going to be doing all of the work here. So what I'm going to do is move now onto a poll. So I'm going to ask you to actually declare, if you can. I'll just see if we can find it. Right, here we go. So the first poll then, what we're looking at there is to really understand what you understand as your authority's implementation process is. So if you'd just like to go ahead and answer for us there, and as far as you know what's happening in your country, then we'll just have a look at those results and see how we're going. Okay, that's just started to dry up a little bit, so I'm about to close that. So if you haven't voted yet, oh no, we're still going here at the moment. There we go. Don't panic, we shall get there. A few more seconds, and I'm going to close it. Okay, I think I'll close that now. I'll give you plenty of time. I'll give you a little bit of leeway on this first one. I sprung that on you a little bit. Okay, so I'll close that. So let's just share what the results are there. So, okay, so good spread there of different approaches, and that again is a challenge straight away. You can see there that 8% of you are saying that the EMARs be adopted fully. Congratulations, I believe you're going to get the biggest results out of that approach. 38% saying adapting EMARs to fit the system. Okay, so there's some benefits that can be shared. 38% of you don't know. That's interesting, and I think obviously, hopefully, understanding what the approach is can let you look into it. I think I should share with you at the moment that there are a number of nations, particularly in Australasia and in the Middle East, where countries are voluntarily choosing to adopt the EMARs as being the regulatory system of choice for them that's being implemented in their own system. So there's a number of nations that we're working with and others that are adopting that standard, and that's good. So 15% of you are actually saying no to that answer. So yeah, maybe that's an opportunity to actually share with your authorities this system, because there's going to be clear benefits at some stage in the future of holding a common approval with what is a growing number of nations throughout the world. Okay, so we'll just get rid of that. So thank you very much for your participation in that. Just get the technology going again. Right, so what we're going to do now is we're just going to zoom into some of the implications for approved organisations. This is really to have a look at what are the key challenges that, in our experience, organisations have been facing, but also really starting to get to grips with some of the opportunities that really come as a result of addressing those issues. So, I'm just going to hand back over to Duane. I believe he's joined us again. So, Duane, would you like to talk us through this, this slide, please?
Yes, thank you, Bob. My internet connection has been restored. So what we have here is to show how the EMAR framework, which has adopted the EASA framework, is all focused around approved organizations. And this approved organization construct is something new in the military domain. It's not something all regulatory authorities have followed in exactly the same way. So what we have in the blue boxes in the back, in the top, is all the initial airworthiness, and the green boxes is all the continuing airworthiness. So when we're looking at initial airworthiness, design organizations designed to design codes, certification standards, that which is declared in the type certification basis, and design organizations provide approved data to production organizations. And those production organizations have a communication channel back to the design organizations if they have any deviations or concessions or waivers, if there's any way that they want to deviate from that approved data. Once a production organization has manufactured something, it releases that product, that part, that hardware or software, product, part, and appliance they've manufactured. They're released with a Form 1. A Form 1 is the passport of that piece of equipment, which they then provide to the continuing airworthiness organization. And the continuing airworthiness organization then makes it available to be either maintained, because they're the organization that's subcontract maintenance, or they provide it to air ops or operations. Now what you'll see from these yellow boxes is the EMAR construct hasn't adopted any of the operational requirements. It's primarily focused on initial airworthiness and continuing airworthiness, not air operations. The remaining blue lines that we have there is the data that flows back and in between these approved organizations. So from the design organization, we get instructions for continued airworthiness that get given to continuing airworthiness organizations, as well as to the maintenance organizations, how to maintain and look after the technologies we've given them to play with. The communication channels back to the design organization is if there are any occurrences. If anything happens that's unsuspected, things have failed, things have gone wrong, there's a communication channel back to the design organization who have a legal, in the EASA framework have a legal obligation, but under the EMAR framework will have to be a contractual obligation to go back and fix those areas where they made mistakes, where they got it wrong. Thank you, Bob.
Okay, right, thanks, Duane. Just to go back on the point you made about the yellow boxes, clearly the EASA system is complete now, so that includes obviously the air operations, the flight crew licensing and crew training organisations, as well as air traffic and aerodromes, so it's a truly integrated regulatory system. In this transitional period, as the different MAAs are picking up the EMARs or continuing to mix the old and new regulatory systems, then we've got a bit of a challenge there in terms of making sure that the existing air operations requirements, for instance, do interface with the new EMAR framework. Obviously, having all of the different stakeholders within the aviation system working under the same system brings huge benefits, because you can standardize the interface between the different players. So this is a consideration for military aviation authorities that are implementing a new system, is to make sure that actually there is a clear interface with very clear accountabilities and responsibilities between the different stakeholders where the regulatory systems may well be different. Okay, we've got our first question come in, so thank you to Stuart for actually putting that in. And he's asked, how close are the EMARs to the current EASA requirements? Okay, great question. Well, the EDA obviously has to freeze the requirements, the standards to which they're working from the EASA system, because it does take time to go through the process to actually militarize the regulations. So some of them are pretty up to date and others are lagging a little bit behind. There are some major changes that are actually coming through in the airworthiness area. In particular, the introduction of safety management systems in a more formal way. So this is something for the future, and I'm sure that the EDA will be looking at that and the way in which it can actually implement to stay up to date with best practice. Clearly, a lot of organisations work in both the military and the civil domains, and again, there's huge benefits that can be reaped with this commonality between the two systems, so that people don't have to actually switch between procedures and processes, etc., that deal with one regulatory system in one area and then flip when you're working in a military area to a different standard. So again, great benefits there for not only the industry but also the end user in terms of cost control and efficiency, reducing the options or the opportunities for error by having a standard system as well. Okay, so let's just have a look. So I'm just going to talk through the whole concept of organisation approvals. I'm going to go through this quite quickly, so if you have got any questions, please just throw those in. So basically the approach that's taken with the EMARs is starting with the regulation. An organisation that is seeking for approval is obviously going to have to apply, and a similar application process exists between both the military and the EASA system on which it's based. Following the application, whether it's actually accepted by the MAA, they will then request a number of documents, including the exposition. Now, the exposition is just a word that was chosen by the European civil domain to actually represent what we would term the procedures manuals, the quality manuals, the management manuals, what it is. So the single word that's actually been adopted within the EASA system and now in the EDA on the whole is the word exposition. So from the regulation, the organisation then develops its means of compliance with the regulation, and that's laid out within the exposition. So that's a challenge straight away in terms of actually developing something that is able to demonstrate compliance with all of the requirements as they laid out in the EMARs. Now, following investigation, an approval will then be granted to the organisation once it has demonstrated that it meets all of the requirements, not only in the exposition, but typically through a physical audit on site to look at all the systems, the infrastructure, the resources, and in particular the competence of the people. So once any findings have been found through a normal compliance audit type of process, then the organisation will be granted the approval. The conditions of the approval: the organisation must continue to comply with the requirements. It also is required to comply with its stated means of compliance that we talked about in the exposition. So once the approval is granted, and in combination with the definition of the work, the scope of work that is declared within the exposition, then the organisation wins itself privileges. Now, within the civil system, that means that they are granted authority to self-certify their output. So that could be an approved design, that could be a product, it could be a part or a component, it could be maintenance, or even to actually examine and maybe license individuals under the licensing system. So those are the privileges. The key to the system really working is that the certificates that are granted under those privileges automatically become acceptable to the other organisations, wherever they are in the participating member states, can be accepted without further showing. Now, this doesn't mean that the operator and through their continuing airworthiness management organisation and their maintainers can actually just blindly accept anything. There are clearly responsibilities that those parties have to look at, looking at the fitness, making sure that configuration is controlled, making sure that what is received is fit for purpose and is the right part number and is a fit condition to be actually fitted. And it's always the end user's responsibility to ensure that it is the correct part and it's in fit condition to be fitted to the aircraft or engine or subcomponent. So okay, so let's just deal with that. So hopefully you can see it's from the privileges that the certificates emerge, and it's the acceptance of certificates that enables the whole system to work. So just going to address some of the key challenges, and some of this came out through the conference that I mentioned, and some of this is our experience with working with people. So organisation interface. So at the moment within the EMAR system, contracts are not approved and not reviewed by the MAAs. Within the civil construct, there are certain technical and interface procedural issues that have to be covered within the contract. So within the civil system, the authorities review the contracts to make sure that the two organisations that are contracting have put in place arrangements that are going to manage the airworthiness of their product and to their service that is actually being provided. This in turn is then embedded within the exposition. So for instance, if a camo is working on behalf of an operator and they contract with a Part 145 organisation, a set format of contract or a set content of contract has to be put in place and approved by the authority, which really identifies what communications, what reporting, how the two organisations will basically interface and work together. This then becomes subject to oversight because it's in the exposition, and the exposition is subject to quality monitoring. It becomes subject to audit. So you can see that two organisations start with a contract. The contract is reflected within the exposition to say how the actual work is going to be delivered, and then the exposition is approved by the authorities along with the contract being approved by the authorities as well. Then the two quality systems of the two parties ensure that the contractual arrangements are actually working. Now, I also put this process in place to ensure that those risky areas of interface between organisations, particularly where you've got an international perspective, are really covered and controlled, so that they're managed by the organisation and then assured by the organisation. So whilst the certificate is portable and can be accepted between the different stakeholders, it is up to the quality system to ensure that all of the processes that sit behind it are working in a robust way. And in that way, with a clear definition of what is required, a clear certification of what is being delivered, then you can rest assured that it meets the requirements, subject to the quality systems doing their checks as required. So that's one of the challenges, and again, the opportunities that are really provided through the EMAR system. So our advice on expositions is to keep it real and keep it value adding. A lot of organisations grab hold of the requirement and say, we're going to need an approval to do this particular work. And they'll start with the regulations and say, right, we need some facilities, we need a tool store, we need some infrastructure and resources. And they use it as a checklist to go down to actually achieve the approval. Now, I'm sure they didn't go into business, whether they're military or civil, to actually meet approval conditions. They went into business to actually produce something, whether it's design, whether it's the production of a component or an aircraft, whether it's a maintenance service, or even indeed training individuals. They went into business to be effective as a business at delivering what their output product is. So what we advise organisations to do is to really focus on what they're trying to deliver. Structure their structure their organisation and secure the resources to make sure that you can deliver on that promise, and then put it into your exposition, checking that it meets the requirement. Now, actually, you could drive it either way, but if you have the emphasis driven from what you're trying to deliver from a product perspective rather than compliance with a regulation perspective, you're more likely to add value in terms of having a compliant organisation that is a good business at the same time. Okay, so that's just a little bit of a reflection on our experience of working with organisations in the military and in the civil sector. Okay, so we have to have a look at the background behind some of the requirements. And I think that people will recognise that quality assurance is embedded, or compliance monitoring, as it's becoming called in the civil area. It's an embedded process within every organisation's management system. The key here is to recognise that within the ARSA system, which actually spawned the lower level regulations that came out of their framework, there is a clear requirement that every organisation must have processes for continuous improvement. Now, you won't see that in EASA Part 145 or EASA Part 147 or any of the other parts indeed. But what is embedded within those technical requirements are the requirements for error management systems, in the future safety management systems, but most importantly at the moment, quality assurance systems that are supposed to ensure that the organisation, from an airworthiness, a safety, and indeed if you use it properly a business perspective, are always focusing on continuous improvement. Now that is embedded within the system. And that was because EASA, when they came up with the whole concept of approval of organisations, they recognised that when an organisation first launches, it may well be compliant with the regulation on paper, but it takes a bit more of that than that to actually achieve an operation in the real world, if you like. So embedded these systems for continuous improvement within them. So our advice is be a learning organisation. It obviously makes sense from a business perspective, but actually from a safety, airworthiness, and indeed a compliance perspective, then you should be looking at that as continuous improvement as well. Okay, the final point then, and we've talked about this a little bit already, so I'm not going to dwell on it too long, the portability of certificates, so cross-border acceptance. What needs to happen is that a standardised certificate is automatically recognised, regardless of whether it's a licence for an individual or whether it's a training course that's been delivered, a product that's been designed, certified or manufactured, and indeed items of maintenance that have been completed. If a standardised certificate is acceptable across the borders, then we're really going to get the benefits of this whole system, and organisations can compete. And it's healthier for everyone in terms of standards, in terms of options, and in terms of actually ultimately the cost to the taxpayers of funding their ministries of defence. So that's something that I would advise that you probably need to look at and encourage with your MAAs, is to try and take a standardised approach as possible to ensure that we gain the true benefits. Casting our minds back to the Cyprus Agreement, where the ministers wanted to achieve those true benefits between nations. Okay, so that was a little bit on the organisation approvals there. So remember, if you've got any questions that are coming in, please drop them in. We'll have a look at those, and I won't even tell people your full name or organisation. There you go. So there's a little bit of anonymity there, honest. Okay. Okay. So just going to have a look at the opportunities, benefits, and challenges, and some of this indeed comes from the forum again, the conference we recently attended. And I'm going to hand over now to Duane just to start this off. So Duane, if you'd like to start off with the opportunities and move through these, then I'll come back in towards the end.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you. Yes, so there are very discrete opportunities and benefits we can explore and try and exploit for commercial advantage and for the benefits of the military authorities. And the first opportunity is the increased market due to recognized organizational capability. What that means is we get one approval and we can then go and sell across national borders. If you're a DOA, you can offer those services as an approved DOA to other organizations in other countries. This is something we do in the civil world all the time, but there's something that we can now gain from in the military environment. We can get recurring revenue as we can sell our approved modifications or repairs or services or even personnel, approved personnel across national boundaries. As Bob mentioned, these approvals mean that our modifications, our repairs, our services, our personnel receive passports. It's a passport that takes across national borders and therefore opens up so much of a wider opportunities for us. Benefits, of course, includes reduced certification costs. Design once, sell many times. You don't have to design and repackage the same design to meet different regulatory requirements. The other benefit is the alignment of military and civil management systems. Some organizations already have a civil or an EHASA Part 21J DOA or a POA or a 145 approval. What this allows, because it so closely matches to the original EHASA intent, is that we could possibly look into using the same handbook, the same procedures to cover multiple approvals, both civil and military. So we have one handbook, one exposition on organization instead of multiples trying to satisfy different regulations. And we all know that when we have personnel in our organizations, they move across projects. One day they're working on a civil, one day they're working on a military. And if your whole construct and all your processes change, there's a bigger chance of human error creeping in. But this all does present us with some challenges. And a lot of the challenges come from the way these regulations are being adopted by the different military authorities. If I take my domain, DOA, one of the challenges we have is the potential for multiple TC holders. A lot of military authorities say, we want to own the type certificate. This is not a construct we have in the civil environment. In the civil environment, it is always the OEMs, the equivalents of Lockheed, Rolls-Royce, Boeing, Airbus, these companies that own the type certificates, they retain the type certificate. So there's a very clear feedback mechanism for the occurrence reporting system to a single type certificate holder. And if an AD, an advisory directive, needs issuing, the regulatory authority goes to the single type certificate holder and says, you need to pull out all stops to figure out how we get this aircraft back into an airworthy condition. What we potentially have in the military domain is multiple type certificates for the same aircraft type. So if we take the A400M as an example, Airbus Military will be the OEM that contains the original type certificate, but potentially every military authority that then purchases the Airbus A400M aircraft will also have a type certificate. And that does really confuse the issue. And there's a separate paper that you can see in the handout sections which you can download where we explore this in a lot more detail and the advantages and limitations of various ways of approaching this. Another challenge we have is that each participating member state could use its own design codes, i.e. there's no common certification basis. So if I use the UK as an example, we rely on DEFSTAN 00970 to a large extent. In the civil environment, we've got CS25 when we design and certify aircraft. In the USA, they've got Mill Handbook 516, I believe. In Australia, they've got different TMAs. So we've got all these technical documents that are out there that actually don't have a common certification basis. So now it becomes very hard when you're modifying or changing an aircraft to know which version of the regulations you're going to use. EMAC-C is a very valiant attempt to try and standardize these design codes, but we really need to pay close attention to what is in there and how it relates to the certification of aircraft and products. The big impact we'll feel here is when we do changes to these type certification bases, if we do modifications and repairs, is going to look at the change classification process and which version of the regulations apply and will they be acceptable across to other military authorities. So for instance, would the French MAA accept a design that was designed to 00970? And you can see the vice versa being a problem. A third challenge we have is that some MAAs do not intend to appoint POAs, production organization approvals. So the problem we have here is if we have a organization that's producing parts and they're releasing those parts with some sort of a certificate of conformance, that certificate of conformance is not recognized by other nations. That immediately is a big barrier to pooling of spares, of optimizing supply chains, and of that particular production organization being able to sell a part with a passport that says this is an approved part. Bob, if I can hand over for the last two back to you, please.
Okay, Duane, I just had a look at those, and I think that we've actually got those covered, so I'm not going to go back into those again. So we've got another question come in. So Jean, thank you very much for your question. So the question is there a specific challenge to non-member companies being approved? So I assume that's non-member state companies being approved. Well, I think that at the moment with the implementation process, it's really down to the individual MAAs where they actually go to in terms of how far or where they are happy to approve organisations. Certainly on paper, it would be possible for a Spanish authority to approve when it's fully implemented, if it's implemented that way, Spanish authority to approve an organisation in Mexico, and then ideally that the certifications would be acceptable throughout all of the member states. So certainly on paper that's something that is possible. In reality, I think it's going to come down to whether the individual MOD in the member state really needs the supplier of those services to be approved to support them contractually to the operation of their aircraft. So it's a great question, and thanks for that, Jean. At the moment, there is no standardised way of approaching this at the moment. So you need to speak to your customer MAA, your customer's MAA, as to what the approval mechanism is in terms of providing services to them. Lovely, thanks for that. And I should have said thanks very much to our first questioner as well. Thanks for that, Stuart. Okay, right, going to move on then. It's time again for you to do some work. So going to go into our second poll. So going to look at that. So just interested in what your feelings are about the benefits of adopting this particular approach, of actual full adoption we're talking about there. So if you'd like to contribute to that, then that would be great. Thank you. Excellent. Okay. Right. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to close. There we go. Share those results. So, unsurprisingly, then we've got 87% of people saying yes, there's clear benefits this way. Now, I think that what we should do with this is to really identify that really the industry, possibly the customers, and we've got a good range of people that are attending the webinar right across the spread, is that the vast majority of people can see that true adoption of these requirements within their member states is really going to add benefit. I think what we need to recognise is that we need to break with the old national borders that actually got in the way of the support solutions that are chosen, and to say we really need to throw ourselves into the EMAR system in a standardised way to ensure that we get the biggest benefits. So great, thank you very much for that. So I'm just going to move on then. We're going to have a look now at the latest EDA views on implementation. Conference down in Lisbon was really well attended. There you can see. I can see you're all scrabbling around to see if you're you're on the picture yourself. You probably know it if you are. Thankfully, I was stood at the back, so it's not too bad. So, there you go. So it was a really good conference. You can see there's a number of nations that were represented that weren't member states. We had perspectives from all over the world, in fact, about the benefits of EMAR and about the way in which it was actually implemented. It's fair to say that the main focus of the conference was to really look at, now that the EMARs have been signed off, are actually in place, it's time to implement them. So it was looking at the challenges of implementation, and in particular how the different models were benefiting the different stakeholders throughout the system. So there were some great conversations that were going on between suppliers, users and MAAs that were represented in there. And I strongly recommend, if you can go to the next conference, it's a really good event. Okay, so just a quick summary, and we may well have covered some of these, but I'm going to flick through these. So it's fair to say that the participant member states are on a journey. Certainly the commitment from the defence ministers is being picked up by all the member states in some form. Some are early and just really started to move forward with their implementation, and others through adoption are actually very well progressed already and starting to see the benefits within their own national boundaries. So it's great to see that actually this is now starting to work in practice, that approvals are being issued and indeed those privileges being granted to people to issue certificates. There are a number of smaller nations that recognise that to actually implement a system on their own is actually quite onerous. Indeed, there are a number of nations that are actually starting to talk about having a common system between them, because then it's just one regulatory system that needs to be maintained, and there's a possibility of sharing the oversight resources and sharing audit results, etc. In their implementation. So that's good to see, and again a standardised approach really facilitates that in terms of those different nations working together, particularly where they're operating similar platforms or aircraft. Okay. We heard about a number of multinational projects, the NH90 and A400M obviously being quite new and having gone through certification processes where a number of nations work together to a single standard, plus possibly some national deviations that came in lower down the chain, and Eurofighter that's been around for a little bit longer. It's benefiting the end users and industrial partners, is what it's fair to say. But the way in which it's working at the moment is that bodies are being formed, and some of them are NATO aligned, and they're actually working together to bring together a single body that looks after the interests of the individual nations. Okay, the message and benefits of the EMARs frameworks are being implemented outside the PMS. I've talked about that a little bit more. I'm working with a number of countries around the world at the moment, and certainly if you look at what is happening in Australia, you'd see that there's almost a model implementation that's going on. They've even got an umbrella regulation that they call their own basic regulation. You've got adoption, not adaptation by the PMS is key, and that just came out over and over again. Okay, so I believe we have a question. I was just going to have a quick look. I can't see that, so hopefully my lovely assistant will. Here we go. Can a civil organisation approval that was accepted to be equivalent to EMAR by one MAA then become acceptable to other MAAs? Okay, yes, is basically the answer. Anything's possible. Ultimately, it's down to the individual MAAs to determine what they're happy to accept. So if arrangements are in place between the two MAAs, then this issue has certainly probably been considered and covered. So what I would say is, actually, yes, you need to meet the requirements and meet the standards of your home MAA, but then on top of that, and it may well be by taking advantage of an EASA approval that you've got, but you'll need to look at the relationship between the two MAAs and see whether there's a level of agreement that allows that approval to be overseen by the the First Nations authority within the second nation. So yeah, that's there. So yes, certainly it's at the moment there is no standardised approach because it's down to each nation state. But ask the question, and I think that should be encouraged. So it was a great question. Thanks, Sebastian. Okay, so I'm just watching the clock ticking round here. I think we're doing okay. Please keep the questions coming. If you've got any more, then I'm happy to answer those. So that was the conference summary that that we attended. The papers and presentations are being made available through the EDA website, so I'd recommend that you have a look on there. It's quite a good website in terms of exploring and finding information, and the conference presentations are normally shown on there, so take a look at that. Okay, so just going to get into the summary in a little while, but really what I really want to look at now is to get your perspective in terms of what the major challenges are that you're seeing within the implementation of this, either for you personally or for your customers or for the authorities. So just going to actually drop down this poll then. Here we go, just coming to terms with the technology here. Okay, so the biggest challenges, in this case you can select 2 answers, so we're just interested here in your top 2 answers. So I'll launch that. There we go, just give you a few seconds to have a look at that, and then we'll just explore what your perception is of the challenges there. Okay, right, we'll stop that there. So last couple of seconds. Excellent, look at that, last minute votes coming in. Excellent. Okay, going to close that poll now then. So, lovely. Okay, well, thank you very much for your input there. That's great. So, just to explore the, I appear to have got a little bit of a screen issue that's coming in there. I clicked the wrong button, I do apologise. Let me have a look here. There we go. Okay, just going to share that. Sorry about that little technology challenge there. Right, so let's just have a quick look at what you got. So your organisation does not understand the intent of the EMARs, 20%. So clearly, having a look at the background of the EMARs, being from the ARSA system, there are massive benefits in terms of a smart implementation of the requirements. If you really understand that the requirements are about achieving safety and quality so that you get a good product output, then really understanding what is behind the regulations gives you the opportunity to implement in a way that not only gets you a certificate on the wall and the ability to trade, but it also helps your organisation to be really efficient in terms of its business. So 13% said that sorry, that was the first one was actually the regulator. The regulator doesn't understand. Now let's have a look at that. Okay, so the Form 4 competencies, clearly there's a lot of emphasis that is actually placed on the managers within approved organisations. They are the ones that are deemed to be the ones responsible for ensuring that the organisation complies with the regulations on an ongoing basis. Clearly from a business perspective, there's business performance issues that need to be addressed by them as well. So Form 4 competencies, that's the management personnel. That's where competence will be assessed, and they do need to do that. So I'm sorry, I got a little bit confused there. That first one was about the organisation not understanding the intent of the EMAR, so I was correct there. Insufficient leadership for the necessary transformation. Okay, clearly both within MAAs and within organisations seeking approval, there has to be clarity and vision about what you're trying to achieve, and that will really lead the way in terms of what the way in which you achieve that. And certainly adding value into the organisation requires good leadership. So 60% multiple MAA implementation policies, yeah, that really screams out, and that's quite a straightforward and understandable one. It must be really frustrating when you have to go to a number of different authorities, be overseen and audited by them, different approvals, different requirements, different procedures. It's just not a smart way of doing business anymore. If we're going to recognise the benefits that are available in civil systems through an approval system, then I think we have to move towards that in the military system as well. So 47% varying national policies on type certification and safety cases. Yeah, I think it's going to take a bit of time, and I remember the implementation of the JARs many years ago when the JAA started to do this. It did take a bit of time for it all to filter through. Obviously, there's a big time lag between agreeing a standard for a project or for an aircraft and actually finally approving it. But I think you'll see more and more it's logical that the EMARs would be the obvious vehicle for taking that forward. Okay, so lovely. Thanks very much for sharing your thoughts on that. Just going to get towards the end then. So just a few minutes left. I think really what we did here was really anticipate some of the points that have come out either through the questions or through the material that we presented. There is an opportunity for transformation. Now, what I mean by that is that traditionally regulatory systems have gradually grown based on experience. We've said that the regulations are written in blood in a lot of cases. You start off with a regulation. If you then have a failure, you end up writing a new regulation as a result of the failure, which could have been an accident, and you end up with a patchwork quilt of accident prevention strategies, and it doesn't necessarily work very well. We believe that there's a massive opportunity in terms of adopting the EMARs through a transformational approach, i.e. you adopt the requirements in a way that actually reshapes the way in which the stakeholders work together, not just making the regulations fit into an existing structure and system within an MAA or within organisations. And to get the big benefits, it needs to be a transformation rather than an evolution. I strongly recommend that you work with your MAA. Having worked with a number of them, they're nice people, really. Some of them have formal capabilities and systems for you to actually put in through steering groups and through consultation processes. I would really recommend that you take the opportunity to engage with them and give them your opinion. Finally, if you want to make this work for your business, then really focus on the intent that's behind the regulations. As I said, don't start with the regulations and then seek an approval. Start with the business output and then build the organisation that complies. Okay, just running down on the time here. So, oh my word. So what was life like before the EMARs? I just hope that we don't end up with the same expressions once we've implemented or partially implemented them in the future. So, sorry, it's just a little bit of Bob humour there. I hope that we've got the intelligence to recognise that this is a huge opportunity that we've got, and we'll all look much more normal, if you like, rather than that particular one. I'm not supposed to laugh at your own jokes, are you? Sorry about that. Okay, so any further questions and answers? Just looking at my lovely assistant, I'm not sure that we've got anything come in there. No, I don't think there's any more in there. So I'm just going to wrap up then and say thank you very much for your participation. Really appreciate that, and thanks very much for joining us. We would like to send you, and in fact as part of the process, you get a follow-up email, and that will have a link to the recording as well as a few questions about the webinar. We'd be interested in what other subjects you'd like to be addressed. Any comments that you've got on this particular one and how it went, whether you like the style or whether we need to do something different. No personal comments on my own accent. However, thank you again for joining us, and certainly I wish you all the luck going forwards with hopefully standardised implementation of the EMARs. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.